I'm Jim Harrington, and I have enjoyed baseball all of my life as a young kid growing up in Sioux City, Iowa. I followed the Sioux City Sioux. They were a part of the Western League back in the late 40s and early 50s. Two of those teams were from Colorado. One was the Denver Bears and the other one was the Pueblo Dodgers. And one of my childhood memories that I remember quite fondly was listening to the radio report that the Sioux City Sioux are getting ready for a game here in beautiful Pueblo, Colorado at Damon Runyon Field. And so many years later, when I moved to Colorado, one of the first things that I did when I had occasion to go down to Pueblo was to find Damon Runyon Field, and it's still there. And it is a beautiful baseball facility. The Sioux City Sioux were a Class A franchise team of the New York Giants. And another story that I remember is there was a phenomenal young ball player that was playing for the AAA franchise, the Minneapolis, whatever their name was, team. And they were going to do an exhibition game against the Sioux City Sioux in Sioux City. So I think I was probably 11 years old at the time. But I managed to secure a ticket to go down and see this phenomenal young ball player. Got to the ballpark early, and only to receive word that he had been called up by the New York Giants, never again to ever play a minor league game. His name was Willie Mays. So I just barely missed seeing Willie play in a minor league game.
Well, he was fast.
He was fast. He was fast. He was very good. And then fast forwarding to 1989, I was at what was called the Arapahoe Republican Men's Club, and Neil Macy was the speaker. And Mr. Macy proceeded to tell everybody about the effort to try to get Major League Baseball for Colorado, that he and Kathy Williams had been instrumental in getting a bill passed through the legislature. And this bill authorized the creation of a Colorado Baseball Commission with a representative from each of the then 6 counties in the Denver metropolitan area, plus some gubernatorial appointees, as well as some legislative appointees. And so I left that morning meeting thinking, wow, I'd love to get involved with this. So I immediately called my friends over at the Board of County Commissioners in Arapahoe County and said I would love to be a part of the Colorado Baseball Commission. And they said, fine, we can do that. And so that led to my appointment to the Colorado Baseball Commission as Arapahoe County's representative. It was an absolutely phenomenal experience. I truly enjoyed it. Met some absolutely wonderful people that are friends for life. Beginning with Sam Simplizio and Larry Varnell, they became the co-chairman of the Colorado Baseball Commission following John DeCue's departure. It started out with John, of course, as the initial chairman, and then I think it was probably about March of 1990 that a decision was made that John would move on and that the Baseball Commission would be reorganized. And so at that time, Sam and Larry became the co-chairs of the Colorado Baseball Commission. My job was treasurer of the Baseball Commission, and then subsequently when we formed Baseball for Colorado, which was the campaign group, I became chairman of the campaign of Baseball for Colorado. Sam and Larry did a masterful job of maintaining focus and keeping everybody energized. For me, having grown up in Sioux City, as I said earlier, and seeing the Sioux City Sioux, one of the people that I remember back from those days was Bill White, who played for the Sioux City Sioux. And so many years, and so we get now to the effort to get baseball here. And I had the occasion to meet a number of absolutely wonderful people, legends like Bill White. I met him in a restaurant here in Denver, and commented to him that I remembered seeing him play when I was a kid in Sioux City. And at this time, of course, Bill White was the president of the National League. Also, I had the occasion to meet George Steinbrenner at a JUCO tournament over in Grand Junction in May of 1990. I walked into the Marriott Hotel where we were all staying, and here's Sam talking to George Steinbrenner. Sam calls me over and introduced me to George. Had a nice conversation with George. Had the occasion to meet Harry Carey at his restaurant in Chicago when we were on a fundraising trip. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Had occasion to meet Bobby Richardson at a fundraiser at Leo Godot's Welshire Inn, and also had occasion to meet Whitey Herzog at the Victory Party on August the 14th of 1990. So a lot of great people, sort of legends in my mind. As treasurer of baseball for Colorado, I had to try and keep revenues and expenses balanced. Joe Blake and Gary Antonoff were our chief fundraisers. Z. Ferrafino was also very helpful. As we got closer to the election, we knew we had to spend more money to get us over the hump. Thus, we went in debt, hopeful that we would pass the election and be able to pay all of our bills. The election passed, and in that final tally, we still owed $50,000. So we did have a problem. Once an election is over, no one wants to make any more contributions, so it's hard to get the money to pay the bills, and so that's not a smart way to do it, but we took the risk, and eventually it paid off. We went to Paul Jacobs, and this took several months before we finally got closure on this. We went to Paul Jacobs, who was with the ownership group, and Paul was able to write us a check to close out the account, and so none of us got sued. We were probably lucky. One of the favorite people I met and got to know during the campaign was Bob Howsam. Listening to his stories about Roger Maris when Bob Howsam brought him to the St. Louis Cardinals, and his stories about the Big Red Machine made me feel like a kid again. It was really an enjoyable experience. I love those stories. Bob Howsam was really quite the guy. One of his lasting contributions was his promotion of the idea to turn the seats along the right field line and left field line more towards the infield instead of straight ahead. And that, of course, is something that we ultimately ended up doing. I also had the pleasure of serving on the Coors Field Stadium Design Committee. John Lehigh was the project manager for the construction of the stadium. Among other things, we strongly supported the idea of flagpoles extending out from the building along 20th Street and along Blake Street, as well as supporting Bob Howsam's seat concept. Going back to the campaign days, I have a few other remembrances. The first meetings of the CBC, the Colorado Baseball Commission, were held in the fall of 1989. All of our meetings during the existence of the CBC were held at the Denver National Bank building at 17th and Lawrence, where I worked. I've always been grateful to Wayne Hutchins and Dave Wallard, who were a couple of my bosses who supported the effort and made sure that we always had a meeting space available anytime that the Colorado Baseball Commission was going to meet. I remember the numerous presentations to the Rotary clubs, Kiwanis, Optimist, Chambers of Commerce, Elks, HOAs, and senior citizen groups. I've lost track of how many I made, but it was probably in the 40 to 50 number, something like that. It was a lot, and I truly enjoyed doing it. It was easy to talk about baseball and the wonderful things that it was going to do for Denver and for Colorado. The day before the election, Roger Kinney asked me to speak to a seniors group at approximately 20th and Lawrence, somewhere in that vicinity. I did that, and their big concern was access and affordability. I promised them the world, and for the most part we delivered. We gave them handicap seating, a lot of good handicap seating. We leaned on the ownership to have the tickets very affordable in the beginning, and I guess with inflation compared with other folks, they're still somewhat affordable here today. You can still get into the game for a fairly inexpensive cost. On election day, I was asked to do a 5 p.m. interview on Channel 7. I went on and repeatedly said my planned line, regardless of the question. The line was, "This is only a penny on $10, which will cost the average family less than a nickel a week, since food, medicine, and services are not taxed." Regardless of the question, that was my answer. When they asked, "Are you really confident you're going to get Major League Baseball here in Colorado?" And I would say, "It's only a penny on $10, which will cost the average family less than a nickel a week." So that was the answer. And it resonated, I think, and I think that in part, and that was sort of the line that everybody was pitching, and it was very true. Around 7 o'clock that evening, I left my office at the Tabor Center to catch the shuttle to go to the election watch headquarters. I got on the shuttle, and who was there on the shuttle but Governor Romer, eating an ice cream cone. He asked me if I thought the election would pass, and I said yes. He said he was not quite so confident. One of the highlights of the campaign was the Continental Airlines charter to Chicago, where we toured the old Kaminsky Park in its last season, the new Kaminsky Park under construction across the street, and the Cubs game at Wrigley Field. For the game, we sat under the press box, and Harry Carey serenaded us with "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" and introduced us to the crowd. That night, we had dinner at his restaurant. We raised about 40% of the total amount that was raised for the campaign in that one excursion. So it was very important. So we raised about $500,000 altogether, and we raised something like a couple $100,000 just from that trip, with the Continental Airlines having donated the charter, or at least significantly underpriced it. The sale of the hats was also a significant fundraiser. They were unique, and a few still exist today. And hopefully, as a part of our effort, we'll be able to round some of those up and include them in the exhibit over at the Colorado History Museum. The amount raised from the hat sales wasn't great, but it made everybody feel real good. Colorado Baseball Commission had a float for St. Patrick's Day Parade. Neil Macy arranged that. I was the voice on the loudspeaker urging everyone to support baseball for Colorado. The vast majority of people in the parade route had no idea who we were or what we were talking about. On March 17, people were not tuned in to an August 14 election for a baseball stadium. I don't know if I was very good, but I did my best to keep a steady stream of chatter. I learned that that's a unique skill. Lastly, I would like to salute Neil and Kathy for their creative vision and determination, which made all of this possible. All of us should be eternally grateful to them. Without them, we may not be enjoying Major League Baseball in the Rockies today. Also, a special thanks to Roger Kinney, Sam Simplesio, and Larry Barnell for their leadership through the election campaign, as well as John DeQ, our CBC chairman, for their first 6 months in honor of the Denver Bears and Zephyrs, as well as the Denver Baseball Group that kept the flame alive throughout the 1980s. So, once again, it was a wonderful experience, wonderful people, and to this very day, there's nothing more enjoyable in the summertime than going to Coors Field and enjoying a baseball game.
Amen, Brother Harrington.
That was great.
Let me ask you some questions about, I think something that folks maybe don't realize is that, of course, Marvin Davis was the initial ticket that we thought we had to bring Major League Baseball here, and then that kind of fell apart. And Federico Pena then kind of formulated the Denver Baseball Commission. When Neil brought me the concept of the bill, we were in a recession at that particular time. And so just trying to lay that stage to some of the presentations that you made, I assume that in your presentations it was opened up for questions and answers, and can you share maybe some of the objections that you were hearing? Besides, and we know that in a recession it's very difficult when you have to talk about the T word or the tax word. But in some of those presentations, did you get some feedback that this was just something that was going to embellish Denver and that really wouldn't be a benefit to the rest of Colorado or the metropolitan area? Or
As I think back on all of those many presentations that I gave, the audiences, for the most part, were very, very receptive. There were a few people that were critical of the fact that you were going to be taxing the public at large for something that only a limited number of people might enjoy. But there really were not a lot of people that were critical of that tax. And again, we just kept repeating that mantra: it's only a penny on $10, and that the overall cost is fairly minimal. And we talked about the quality of life and how Denver is a major league city, And I oftentimes also repeated the story that I didn't mention in my remarks here, but yeah, prior to coming to Denver, I lived in Kansas City, and I thoroughly enjoyed the Kansas City Royals. I went to a lot of their games, and so shortly after I got out here, I remember going to a presentation one of the Colorado Baseball Commission guys gave. I'd only been out here for maybe a year. This was like in 1984. And I remember asking him the question, why in the world don't we have Major League Baseball in Colorado, here in Denver? And his answer was, we're doing our best, we're trying hard. And he told, of course, the Marvin Davis story and so forth. But again, to your question, there were a few people that were critical, but the only real criticism really was the tax. It was the very idea of taxing people for something that some people felt should be privately financed. But other than that, I think everybody bought into the idea that baseball would be a great amenity, that we already had professional football. We didn't have hockey at that time. I think we had the Nuggets. I think the Nuggets were already here. So baseball was a big part of the equation in terms of the overall sports experience, a big part that was missing. And again, most people were very supportive. And I've been involved in a number of initiatives, and I would say that for the most part, the audiences that I spoke to were more receptive on this than many of the other things that I've been involved in. So.
Well, we know that Arapahoe County and Douglas County and Jefferson County carried by big numbers, not so much certainly in Denver, and it's certainly lost in Adams County. Interestingly enough, those areas, for the most part, are kind of viewed as fiscally conservative, but do you think they felt there was an economic development and maybe quality of life?
I think it was both of those things. I think it was an economic development factor, and most certainly a quality of life. It was just an important part of the overall equation, the overall entertainment experience that was missing. And so, notwithstanding the fact that the two counties you mentioned, Arapahoe and Douglas, tend to be very conservative, I think that the economic development benefits and the experience, the opportunity outweighed any concern that they had from a taxing standpoint.
Right. Well, the initiative only passed with 54% of the vote. So obviously your campaign efforts in raising money could have easily made the difference between 54 and 49.
Well, it was true then and it's true today that anytime you're looking for voter support on something, you have to have a campaign. You have to have a positive campaign, and you've got to get the message out. And without money, that doesn't happen. And so the financial piece of this was very, very critical. And it was difficult raising the money. We knew going in that it was going to be, I think we estimated about a $600,000 campaign. We ended up with a $550,000 campaign, and as I spoke earlier, there was a $50,000 hole there. Initially, trying to get the ball rolling and raise money was extremely difficult, and we're very fortunate that Bill Daniels stepped forward and wrote a check for $100,000, and that's what kick-started the whole effort. And then after that, we started to get some checks, nothing of that nature. As I mentioned earlier, $200,000 came from our fundraiser, and we probably had another $25,000 or $50,000 that came from fundraisers. And so we had to raise about $250,000 additional from individual contributions and corporate contributions, and we did it, and we were successful.
So, from everything we understand, there were some early polls that were done, and it appeared in those polls that the numbers were as bad as 60% against and 40% for.
I remember that.
So, and it seemed like also at that particular time, there'd be a story about every other day about another city that wanted to have Major League Baseball in their particular area. What kind of an impact, I mean, did you worry that even if we passed it, that we might not get a team?
I think that was a concern because of obviously Phoenix was in that mix. Was it Miami, Tampa Bay? There were a number of good-sized cities that we were going to be competing against. And even back then, there was some concern about baseball at altitude. Not nearly the concern that seems to exist today, but there was some concern. And so I think that we all knew going in that even if we passed the stadium vote, that there was no guarantee that we were going to get baseball. And so I think one of the really good things that was done by the people that crafted the bill, you folks, is the stipulation that the stadium would not be built unless we were awarded the franchise. So even though there was a positive vote, we weren't going to be doing a build it and they shall come exercise if it wasn't going to be that way.
And what would have happened if it hadn't passed? What do you think would have happened?
If it hadn't have passed, I think it would have been a long time before we would have tried it again. And we definitely would not have been awarded a team. Absolutely not. I mean, that was made crystal clear at the outset of our efforts that without a stadium being approved, the construction of a new stadium, baseball only, that we would not be competitive.
So one of the things that I remember, and it seems to be backed up by, what I'm hearing from some of the other folks who did have conversations with Major League Baseball, is that there were no written criteria and that they were pretty closed-mouthed about, what the criteria was and, when they were going to make the award and whatever. But it seemed as if certainly the stadium was something, and then we also heard that you needed local ownership and that you would probably need some commitment for season ticket sales. Do you remember anything about season ticket sales or any of those efforts?
I don't remember too much about season ticket sales, probably because I guess I was never very concerned that would ever be a problem. Coming up with the money for a local ownership group, yeah, we knew that was one of the criteria. And you're right, there were very little was told in terms of these are the boxes you need to check, and if you check them, you're going to be pretty sure you're going to get a baseball team. They didn't want to go there. And I remember we sent people to some of the winter meetings of the owners and things like that, and we're basically told stay away. And so we were faced, in the other cities that were competing, were faced with the same dilemma. What is it that you best should do in order to enhance your chances of getting a team? And so it was kind of a blank slate, and but we knew the stadium was definitely a requirement. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And then the local ownership group, initially we didn't start out with local ownership, and the Mona Santanucci exercise, and that was interesting, to say the least.
Yes, yes.
And then when the ownership group was reconfigured, and the Coors group was brought in, that obviously made a big difference. I think that Jerry McMorris, was another hero of the whole effort. I think that Jerry was so committed to the effort, and he put himself and his family and his business on the line to try to make this happen. So I think he's another person that deserves mention and deserves an awful lot of credit. Too bad he's not with us.
Because I would agree with that. I think he would have been another Pat Boland kind of owner, and it would have been a real tribute to the community.
Yep.
So you're a finance kind of guy, and one of the other challenges...
That's why I'm always made treasurer.
One of the other challenges that we have that I don't think a lot of people know is that we were not only in a recession, but we had several other things going on. We had a convention center and an airport and a new Denver Public Library, and we were talking about financing the stadium with private activity bonds, and there was a cap on the allocation. And are you aware of any of those discussions of trying to wrangle private activity bond cap out of some of the surrounding communities so that we could sell bonds?
Well, there were a lot of different scenarios that were investigated, and that was one of the approaches. That's a more difficult approach and a more costly approach. And at the end of the day, they were able to configure the financing structure in a way that they were able to do tax-exempt bonds. And that just saved the taxpayers an awful lot of money. And as a result, you know, the vote initially authorized 20 years for repayment of the debt to build the stadium. And a combination of the fact that the financing was done as a tax-exempt financing, coupled with the fact that there was significant growth in the economy. And so that penny on $10, if you go back to 1989, it generated about $12 million a year. Today it's up to about $60 million a year. So it's grown phenomenally. But the growth of that, together with the economic development, the boom in the economy, and as I said, the tax-exempt bond structure allowed the baseball stadium to be paid off in 10 years. And so as a result, we were able to, the community was able to go back to the voters in 1998, I think it was, seeking permission to use the remaining 10 years of that authorization for construction of Sports Authority Field. And so we basically ended up with a 2-for-1.
We had a doubleheader.
That's right.
A double hitter.
Double hitter.
So, do you remember, did you do talk radio at that time, and any of that? Do you remember the criticisms by Peter Boyles, or do you remember Woody Page saying that this group didn't have their act together and it was going to fail and we were going to ruin the chances of for everybody forever having baseball here?
I definitely remember those criticisms. I remember encountering them outside of our meeting rooms a number of times over at Denver National Bank, and sort of being berated by, to the extent of not having our act together. And they were following our efforts in terms of fundraising, and they knew that people were not writing big checks, and that it was a difficult effort. And so I think it was on that basis that they were very critical, plus the fact that some of them felt that no way should we take this on and try to do it without the criteria being laid out on the table, without knowing exactly what the target was. And to your point earlier, we didn't know what that target was. So
Sure.
I guess to that extent their criticism maybe was had some basis, but for the most part I think that history has proven that they were wrong, and we who were committed to the effort were right.
Na.
Yeah, so you have season tickets. Do you still have season tickets?
Neil, that's a sore point. For 24 years I did have season tickets, and this year most of the members of my group, there were about 7 other members of my season ticket group, decided to not renew, and so that forced me to make
after last season's performance?
After last season, the last 2 or 3
Yes,
years.
yeah, well, maybe.
So that led me to make a difficult decision to give up my season tickets behind the first base dugout. And
You didn't want to go to 81 games yourself?
No, that's a difficult proposition.
I forgot the question I was going to ask you.
Do you have any other comments or thoughts?
Only that I think the effort that the two of you are taking on to record this for posterity, I think, is very good. I think that it was a unique effort on the part of some dedicated people in the community that decided to take this on and try to make it happen, and that it requires a commitment, it requires sacrifice of family time and money and so forth in order to pull one of these things off. It's not easy, and so the very fact that we're capturing it and are going to have a historical record of that previously did not exist, I think is good. You know, I reflect back, there were some other very good members of the commission that have passed away. Chris Christensen, Douglas County representative who was a good friend. Fortunately, he did not live very long to see the fruits of his efforts. And there's
Sue O'Brien.
Sue O'Brien is another one. Sue is a very dedicated member of the commission. And of course, Sam and Larry, and to this day I miss them.
And Bob House.
Huh?
Bob
Bob
Housen.
House.
Oh, Bob Housen, of course, of course. So, you know, doing this, sitting down and preparing some notes for this little interview, brought back some really, really fond memories. And I feel in many ways blessed to have had the opportunity to be involved in this. And every time I drive by Coors Field, I think, yeah, I helped to make that happen.
It's amazing to see it sitting there and how it
Yeah.
germinates with an idea and a lot of work and
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that has amazed me is the conversation with Federico, where he has indicated that several communities who want to build a sports field of some kind and bring Major League Sports to their city have called and talked to him about how do you bring a community together in a united effort to get something like that done. And it probably seems all that much more impossible today when the two-party system seems so polarized and bifurcated. That, do you think if we were to start this effort over again today, that the climate in Colorado is such that we could do it?
No, I think just as the last time, I think we could do it and we could be successful. I think one of the big differences between what we experience here in Denver and many of these other communities that try to do things like a baseball tax, a stadium tax, or a scientific and cultural facility district tax, which I've also been involved in. But the big difference is that in most of those cases, there's not a sense of regional collaboration. We have regional collaboration here, and we have 7 counties in this Denver metropolitan area that see fit to come together to do positive things from an economic development standpoint and from an entertainment activity standpoint. The other communities don't seem to be able to pull that off. I know that Seattle, of course, has their major teams, but of course they've got Paul Allen and people like that just write the check. But you know, they've been trying to get something similar to our scientific and cultural facility district, but they've not been able to pull together a collaborative group encompassing more than just the city of Seattle. And but here in Denver, you mentioned earlier that Denver itself voted against it. Had this just been a Denver effort and not a regional effort, it would not have passed and we wouldn't have baseball.
That reminds me of the question that I forgot, and that is, you know, there was a time that Federico Pena came to me and said, you need to designate in the bill that it's going to be a Denver site. And at that time, I had a conversation with him that said, you know, Federico, we can't do that. I mean, if we don't have the 6-county tax base, we aren't going to have enough income to retire the debt.
Yep.
And I said, we'll probably narrow it down to 3 sites and we will open it up, but most communities will probably recognize that to build the infrastructure and make the investment necessary to support a stadium would be difficult. Did Arapahoe County toy with the idea of having the stadium in Arapahoe County?
Not so much the county, but the city of Aurora, yes. The city of Aurora, Paul Tower was the mayor at the time, and or I'm pretty sure mayor. I'm sure Paul was the mayor.
I think so, because he and I debated a few times.
Yes, yes, and so he kind of coveted having a stadium located in Aurora. The rest of Arapahoe County, I think that the feeling was that it just makes sense to put it at the center of mass of the 6 county area, and I think that was a very astute decision to not specify it as a Denver site, just from the standpoint of the community support. Had you specified that it be in Denver at the time of the election, it would have been one more bullet that the opponents would have used to take shots at it. And there's always going to be opponents anytime you have an election. And so to the extent that you can reduce the amount of the number of targets that they have to shoot at, the better off you are.
Well, one of the things that we did in the bill to allay some of that concern on behalf of, and it was probably more Adams County because of the situation over the airport and not having jobs at the airport, that we put revenue sharing into the bill, that once the debt was retired, that revenues would be shared on a percentage as to the same percentage that was paid into the sales tax base. Did you get any feedback from your commissioners or cities that that was a good thing for them, or do you think they didn't care?
I don't think they cared. I think that they thought, okay, it's a tax that's authorized for 20 years. It's going to take 20 years to pay off the debt, so that piece of it was meaningless. I think was kind of the attitude that they had. And by virtue of how things played out, that's exactly what happened. There was the final payment on the second stadium was made at the expiration in 2011 of the tax.
Well, I think there was a little bit of money left over that was shared, and then, of course,
Very little, yeah.
right, some of the revenue streams that were given away that were supposed to go back to the counties that ultimately didn't. But
Yeah.
that's the way things go sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for all your participation, all the great things you did. So.
I would say, Jim, thank you very, very much.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity.
Okay.
The shutter open?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It's important.
One of our meetings was over at the governor's mansion, and we walked in thinking it was going to be the baseball commission and maybe a couple of the stadium district board people, and that was it. And with the meeting with the governor, trying to figure out new strategy, direction, and so forth. And Jerry McMorris was sitting there, and that was the first time that I had a hint that McMorris was involved in this whole effort. And he was just sitting there quietly taking notes, and of course became ultimately an integral part of the overall effort to get Major League Baseball here. But I still remember walking in the governor's mansion and seeing this guy over in the corner, a nice suit and tie, saying, who is that?
Well, as Trigg was saying, you know, when the governor, he was in, was it Rhode Island or some New Hampshire?
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island. He had gone for a business opportunity there, and he got a call late at night from Roy Romer saying that Mickey Monis is going to be indicted tomorrow, and we need to scramble and get replacements now for Antonucci and Monis in the baseball thing. So he must have had that meeting subsequent to Monis and Antonucci, because I don't think McMorris was a part of that original group.
No, he was not, and this was prior to the election.
Oh,
This was
really?
prior to the election, and so that's what was interesting about it. We had no idea that he ultimately would become a part of the ownership group, and so he was kind of following it and making notes on it, and I guess having some discussions. Of course, you know, the ownership group that they put together, they had to come up with $95 million. So of course finance, but they had to come up with $95 million. And when you think of what a franchise costs today, what are they talking? 700, 800 million. So, but at that time, 95 million was a big hurdle, and so I've never known what the breakout was, the contributions on the part of the various parties, but McMorris was. The point is that he had an interest going back to the campaign days,
Right.
and so it was interesting years. I mean, months later to see him emerge as as the key figure in the ownership group.
Well, and I know Trigg was mentioning that when they kind of exhausted the sources in the Denver metro area, that they went to Vail and called some meetings of some of the heavy hitters in and around Vail, and brought them to the table. He mentions, and I kind of vaguely remember this, that a fellow by the name of Nichols from out east was interested in being an owner, but he was kind of doing his own thing and kind of leading in the newspaper articles about, you know, he's going to be the guy and whatever. Does that ring a bell with you?
That rings a bell, and I'm trying to place exactly what I remember about that name. But yeah, there was a guy named Nichols who was also trying to get involved
To
out
muscle
here.
right into the deal, yeah.
But had it not been, you know, once the Mona Santanucci deal fell apart, they had their problems. There was really a real scramble to try to figure out how they're going to pull things back together and keep this team together, because Major League Baseball was adamant that, and I've heard the story, I don't know if this is a fact, but that Major League Baseball was adamant that Coors was going to have to step up to the plate. And that if Coors did that, it became a part of the ownership group, why that would save it.
Well, Coors early on came and met with Neil and I and said, you know, we don't think we can be an owner. One of the lessons that our father had taught us was that if you get too far afield from what made you your fortune, so, you know, that's when they always started talking about, you know, naming rights or things where they weren't going to be involved in the day-to-day management, which I think Antonucci and Monas left to their own devices on the day-to-day management was not necessarily a good thing. I mean, I don't think they were honest about their businesses. I don't think they would have been honest about the ownership around the Rockies either, so.
Yep. Another name from back in that area is Steve Earhart. I don't know if Steve's name has come up in any of these interviews,
Yes.
but.
And that he was more of a facilitator bringing Monas and Antonucci to the table, is
Yep.
the impression that we got from Trig.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep, exactly.
So, anyway, interesting times, interesting days, huh?
Yes.
And I just can't believe it was that long ago. I
It
mean,
is. Well, it's kind of funny, you know, when you think about it. We're talking about things that happened 27 years ago, 28 years ago. And it was such a significant event in my life that it really wasn't hard to recall many of the details. And
one of those like, where were you the day Kennedy was shot?
exactly, that kind of a thing, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you, Jim.
yeah.
Okay.